I could have the next, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we're going to, the first theme I mentioned is regionalism. Now, these counties that you're looking at right now, a lot of them didn't exist during the time of the Regulator Rebellion. For instance, Orange County was massive. Without Guilford, Randolph was part of Orange County. Anson County was a massive county as well. And many counties spun out of Anson County. But regionalism, it exists today in the state. Think about different types of barbecue, if you will. You have the Eastern style, the Western style. Think about the state dances, if you will. You have shagging, you have clogging, and I joke around with some friends and say maybe the great compromise in North Carolina history is when the legislature declared clogging the official dance of the western part of the state and shagging the official dance of the eastern part of the state. But regionalism still exists, but it was far more pronounced back in the mid 1700s, late 1700s. For instance, Tennessee, what's now Tennessee, was part of North Carolina until 1796 or 1790s. So Tennessee was part of North Carolina. In an effort to provide a common North Carolina culture, people would name newly Western counties after more famous politicians or people from the eastern part of the state. Think, for instance, of Swain County, Macon County, Iredell County, Ashe County. So regionalism existed during the day. There was no radio, there was no TV, there was nothing like that providing a common culture. Then the capital was way far away. Imagine if you live in what's now Iredell County and you had to go to New Bern for business. Also, Lord Granville, one of the only Lord proprietor at the time that still owned part of North Carolina. People like when the Moravians in Old Salem wanted to do land deals, they would have to go to the land agent that lived in Edenton. That's a long trip now from Winston-Salem to Edenton. Imagine what it would be like in the 1750s, 1760s. So regionalism was much more pronounced during the time. The capital rotated from Edenton, New Bern, but Tryon, well, a little bit before then, but Tryon made New Bern the permanent capital, if you will. And just the amount of space between the western part of the state of counties and the capital created this sense of regionalism, a sense of otherness, if you will. And it can be seen in the legislature as well. Eastern counties had more representation in the legislature. And so the legislature was reluctant to create more western counties because that would mean the western part of the state would get more votes in the legislature. So regionalism was a factor that led to the events of May 16th, 1771. If I may have the next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a picture of Sandy Creek Baptist Church, which is in Liberty, North Carolina. That's, if you don't know, that's the upper northeastern corner of Randolph County. Denominationalism was also a factor. It underpinned a lot of the regional differences. There were some denominations that were more prevalent in the Piedmont than they were in the eastern part of the state. Some of the leading regulators were Herman Husband and Shubal Stearns. Herman Husband lived near this church, a few miles away from this church, but he was a Quaker. He was a successful pamphleteer in the sense that he persuaded many people to believe the way that he thought about politics and the events that were happening in North Carolina. And one of his more famous pamphlets is "Show Yourselves to be Freemen." I remember when I was at the Battle of Alamance site, I bought like a bumper sticker that it basically has that phrase on it. Shubal Stern was the pastor of the Sandy Creek Baptist Church. He sympathized with the regulators' complaints. However, he soon thought that the regulator movement became too violent. And we'll talk about some of those events here on the fourth point. So when Shubal Stern started to speak out against some of these things, attendance dropped, it plummeted. The other religious figures at the time who had different viewpoints, one was George Meiklejohn, who was a minister in New Bern, Anglican, and in his sermons, he would write about how regulators should be subject to the higher powers. Charles Woodmason was a missionary who went to the Piedmont to encourage more formal worship. For instance, one of his sermon titles was "Bring No Dogs With You." If I could have the next slide, please. And this brings us to the fourth point about taxation. Here is many inhabitants of various counties like Anson, Rowan, Orange, even the Baptist denomination. They would write these petitions to the government that had various complaints in them, but a common one was this one. If I may have the next slide, please. This is the one from Anson County, the petition of the inhabitants of Anson County, that the poor inhabitants in general are much oppressed by reason of disproportionate taxes, and those of the western counties in particular, as they are generally in mean circumstances. In some, it was a vicious cycle. There were what they considered excessive legal fees. There was a lack of currency to pay these legal fees. Sometimes the regulators offered to barter to pay off the debts. When that was rejected, that means of payment was rejected, goods were seized and then they were sold. Without a horse, it becomes even more difficult for a farmer to grow a crop, therefore to pay off his taxes. So again, it was a vicious cycle. And land titles cost less in the East than they did in the West. Another example, a good juxtaposition of the differences among some in the eastern part of the state and the Piedmont part of the state is Tryon Palace. If I can have the next slide. Most regulators lived in cabins such as the Allen House, and these folks were having to pay taxes to build what William Tryon wanted to build in New Bern, which is the Tryon Palace. So there were taxes on wine and liquor to pay for the building of this government building. It cost twice as much as estimates had in the beginning, and it symbolized in the regulator's mind what was wrong with the system, so to speak. If I could have the next slide, please. So we have regionalism, we have denominationalism, we have taxation, legal fees as a complaint, and another is just the game of politics or the struggle for power, if you will. In 1768, the Sandy Creek Association formed. Remember the church, the Sandy Creek Baptist Church, it's in that area that this association formed. Sheriff Edmund Fanning, who lived in Orange County, who saw this as corrupt, and he called the association an insurrection. In time, the association disbanded. Things are becoming more intense in time. In 1768, there's what historian Wayne Lee calls the Hillsborough confrontation, where the regulators became more militant and aggressive, and this is what Shubal Stearns would criticize. For instance, one example is the regulators took a Sheriff Hawkins to Hillsborough, made him ride backwards on a horse, something that was called a skimmington back in the day, and that was just to embarrass an official and try to get him to perform his duty. Well, such events made Sheriff Edmund Fanning call the regulators, quote, rebels, insurgents to be shot, hanged as dogs, end quote. And then 2 years later, we have the Hillsborough riot of 1770, and the image on the left is Governor Tryon and the regulators. That is a common picture that you'll see in a lot of books. In short, in September of that year, 1770, about 50 regulators met in Hillsborough. They packed the courthouse. They debated for 30 minutes. When their requests were ignored, they attacked a lawyer outside of the courthouse under duress, and no surprise, Judge Henderson granted their request. Henderson got out of Dodge, so to speak, that night. And soon after this event, the regulators targeted Fanning, meaning that they ran him out of town, plundered his home. They would burn effigies of the sheriff in town. Remember, this is September of 1770. Governor Tryon says order must prevail, and he wants to enforce that order. And that leads us to the Battle of Alamance in May 1771. Many farmers met on that field to protest, really not to do battle, because some of them didn't have guns. There's accounts of the regulators wrestling and so forth, but the royal officials wanted them to disperse. A couple years before, a riot act passed in the legislature, which essentially, it was called the Johnston Riot Act because Samuel Johnston, who later became one of the first U.S. senators from North Carolina, sponsored the bill. But basically, after the Riot Act was read, people had 1 hour to disperse or consequences would occur. Well, the Riot Act was read. An hour later, William Tryon gives his order. Nobody fires a shot. He says that phrase, fire on them or fire on me, and the battle ensued. In the end, 29 men died, 20 were regulators, 9 were militia. 15 regulators were arrested, 12 were convicted, six were pardoned, and 6 were hanged. And then regulators were told to sign like an oath of allegiance, sort of, to never do this again. And the regulator movement ended essentially on that battlefield on May 16th, 1771. And to reiterate, what got North Carolinians to that point was a sense of regionalism, differences in denominationalism, what the regulators considered to be excessive legal fees and taxation, and then politics and power led North Carolinians to this event on May 16th, 1771. And again, that's just a cursory look at the regulator movement, and I will be happy to do my best to answer questions in the Q&A if there are any, but I will turn the time over to Mark and to others so Mark can talk about his in-depth research regarding land deeds.
I'm going to introduce Mark first. Mark Chilton is currently the Register of Deeds of Orange County, and he has served in that capacity for 2 terms so far. He just recently won his primary election, so he will be returning as Register of Deeds at the end of this election series because he is running unopposed. So congratulations, Mark, on that. Some of his background, he became the youngest official elected to public office when he served on the Chapel Hill Town Council in 1991. He has also served as the mayor of Carborough from 2005 to 2013. Mark has a bachelor's degree in geography as well as a law degree. He has combined these 2 loves and his work as the Register of Deeds to focus his historical research on the individuals associated with the regulator movement in North Carolina. Through his presentation, you will learn how he has used deed records to identify communities and their allegiances to the movement. So, Mark, I'll turn it over to you and let you tell your story.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Becky, and thank you, Troy, for a great kind of overview of what happened in the regulator uprising of 1768 to 1771. And I want to basically today kind of share 3 maps that I've drawn using both research that I have done and research that that others have done about the locations of various people who were lived in this area where the regulators were active in that time period. And you'll see some thanks to other people who are mentioned on the face of these three maps, and they're among the many people who participated in the process of creating these maps. So I just want to, full disclosure, say they're not entirely my work, but they're the collective result of a lot of people researching old land records in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And today I want to look in particular at three neighborhoods, three rural neighborhoods. When I say neighborhood in this time period, we're thinking of rural communities, not urban neighborhoods such as we often think of that term now. And each of these neighborhoods had a church or a couple of churches that were at the center of them, and that were the focus of and defining feature of each of these neighborhoods. And we're going to look at each of these areas in the context of a document called Regulator Advertisement Number 9. So Regulator Advertisement Number 9 is one of a series of petitions that various regulator figures signed in the spring of 1768. The petition itself is undated, but it appears to have been from right around the 30th of April, right around the end of April 1768. And the subject matter of the petition is sort of pedestrian, in that really all it says is it's a complaint from property owners that they are having to pay higher recording fees at the Register of Deeds office than than people in other counties to the east of them. That basically the Register of Deeds, Edmund Fanning, was extorting extra money out of them in order to get their deeds recorded. And so, as I say, it's a not a very significant document as far as giving us that much information about what was at stake in the regulator dispute. Troy has already outlined that that was one of the issues, but there were many other important issues too. But what's significant about Regulator Advertisement Number 9 is that, unlike all the other regulator petitions, we have the names that were signed to the end of the petition. This is because we don't have any of the original petitions. They're all long gone. But the regulator petitions were recopied and sent to London. And at the end of each of those petitions, the copyist simply wrote, signed by 200 men, or signed by 150 men, or whatever. But for whatever reason, when he copied Regulator Advertisement Number 9, he actually copied down the names that were signed below. And so we have a list of names of 450 or so farmers of the North Carolina Piedmont who actually signed one of these petitions. And that's a good indication of who was involved in the regulator movement in Orange and Rowan counties in April of 1768. This is notable because we don't have a list of who all those 1,000 or so men that Troy mentioned earlier were that were at the Battle of Alamance. There is no roster on the regulator side. And in fact, there's a lot about the regulator movement that was sort of semi-secretive. So they tended not to make lists of people who were involved in the regulator movement, because they feared that any such list of people would be used as a basis for prosecuting them for various crimes later on. So Regulator Advertisement Number 9 is sort of unique in this respect, and you can find a copy of Regulator Advertisement Number 9 in the Colonial Records of North Carolina. There's a typed up version of it, and I believe there are photostats of the copy that was sent to London that are at the State Archives in Raleigh. So the first map we're going to take a look at is, hopefully, let me see if I can do this correctly. Yes, it seems to be working. Everybody can see this map, hopefully. And you see, I entitled it "Subject to the Higher Power," which is a quote directly from one of the things that Troy Kickler mentioned earlier, a passage from Romans 13, a letter from St. Paul to the Roman Christians, in which he says that that we should all be subject to the higher powers that exist, meaning not God, but meaning the civil powers that exist. And St. Paul went on to write in this passage from Romans 13, they that resist the power, the powers that are ordained by God, receive to themselves damnation. And this passage was often quoted by various religious leaders at this particular time as a way of encouraging people who were thinking about rebelling against the lawful powers of North Carolina, the governor of North Carolina, or the local governments in Orange and Rowan counties, as a way of cautioning them that that these powers, whether they were just or unjust, had been ordained by God, and that they would be damned if they disobeyed these powers. In this particular map, we're looking at a Presbyterian community. This is, you can see in the inset down below where this is today. This represents a large chunk of Guilford County. And all these people who are highlighted in yellow, all these landowners who are highlighted in yellow, are mentioned in various history books or on graves in the church graveyards at Buffalo Presbyterian Church and Alamance Presbyterian Church, both in Guilford County. All of these landowners, therefore, would appear to have been Presbyterians and were members of either Buffalo Presbyterian or Alamance Presbyterian Church. Now, the Presbyterian Church did not have all that many ministers in the Piedmont of North Carolina back in this time period. In fact, there were precious few, just 4 in 1768. And one of those 4 was the Reverend David Caldwell, who was the pastor for both Alamance Presbyterian and Buffalo Presbyterian. So all these people highlighted in yellow were all looked to Reverend David Caldwell as their pastor. And what is I think particularly striking and notable about this is that not one of these people signed Regulator Advertisement number 9. Not one of these people were participating in April 1768 in the beginnings of the resistance movement. They were subject to the same inflated legal fees that their neighbors were in other neighborhoods, but they were subject to those fees in the context of a legal system that at some level was working for them. They did not feel the need or desire to speak out about excessive fees, and this was in part a function of the leadership of Reverend David Caldwell and his urging of Presbyterians in his congregations to comply, to not resist but to be subject to the higher powers. So I think this is very interesting to note. We have all of these Presbyterians in a large area of Guilford County, and yet among them we find not one person who signed Regulator Advertisement number 9. Contrast that with, let's see, we're going to switch now. I apologize that I am not super technically proficient on how to make this happen more smoothly. But let's contrast that with another neighborhood nearby. So again, in the upper right there, you can see the inset that shows the approximate area that's depicted by this map. This is more of a close-up view. And this map is entitled Obnoxious to the Crown. This map shows us a Germanic neighborhood. It's tempting to describe these people as Germans, but Germany as a country didn't exist at that time. So what we can say is that they were Germanic, or that they were largely German-speaking people from various areas that are now Germany and Switzerland, and perhaps a little bit from the territory that is now northern France. But there was a large contingent of German-speaking people, of Germanic people who lived in the Alamance Creek watershed in Alamance and Guilford counties, and even extending down into Randolph County, though this close-up only shows us mostly Alamance and a little bit into Guilford County. And what I think is important to recognize here is that, again, using church histories and looking at names on graveyards, on graves and graveyards at various churches in this area, we can identify people who were likely or apparently German Reformed church members as opposed to Lutherans. So the German Reformed Church has as its theological founder John Calvin. So these are the Calvinist people as opposed to the Lutheran people. Calvinist churches are sort of bottom-up churches that are organized in much the same manner that the Presbyterian Church is, for example, because the Presbyterian Church is also a Calvinist church. But unlike the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians to their west in Guilford County, these Calvinists took apparently a very different view of the events that were happening in Orange County in this time period. So we can see here marked with orange, with an orange dot, are people who signed Regulator Advertisement number 9. And you'll notice that the people who are outlined in green on this map are, by my calculation, members of the German Reformed Church. And I guess the interesting point to make here is that every single one of these people who signed Regulator Advertisement number 9 appears to have been a member of the German Reformed Church, and that none of the people who were apparently Lutherans signed on to that same petition. So we see here within the German-speaking community on Alamance Creek that there was a clear division in April of 1768 between Lutherans who were more inclined to not necessarily support the government or agree necessarily entirely with the government or the way that Orange County was being run, but were inclined not to cause waves, not to sign protest petitions, but contrast that somewhat over half of all the people that I identified here as being members of the German Reformed Church, nearly somewhat more than half of them were people who signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9. So clearly a very different approach being taken by members of the German Reformed Church. Shortly, a few years after the Regulator Advertisement number 9 was signed, sometime toward the end of 1769 or the beginning of 1770, a German-speaking minister came to this area from down near Charlotte or Kannapolis. His name was the Reverend Samuel Souther, and you can see here in this area of the map that Samuel Souther bought a farm and moved to the neighborhood. Reverend Samuel Souther was brought up as a German Reformed minister, though he had up until this point always served both German Reformed congregations and Lutheran congregations, and typically had performed his services in churches that were shared between the two denominations. So in other words, there was one church building in a particular neighborhood that was the Germanic church, but both the Lutherans and the German Reformed people would meet there to go to church, not necessarily at the same time, either on alternating Sundays or at different times of the day on Sundays. They would have their church services, and Reverend Souther would lead both services, both the Lutheran and the German Reformed. But when Souther arrived in this area, he had previously been a supporter of Governor Tryon's when he lived down in the Mecklenburg area, but various things had happened to cause him to change his mind. And by the time he arrived in Orange County, he had become very enamored of the Regulator cause, and in fact began to see the Regulator cause as a almost a he viewed it with through a religious lens, and saw that the liberation of the people of the North Carolina Piedmont from oppression was a sort of religious duty, and he began to preach in the various churches, German-speaking churches in this area, including Lau's Church, which is over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but hopefully Lau's Church over here in the southwest corner of this map, as well as at Stoner's Church, which was up here in this area near the confluence of Stinking Quarter Creek and Great Alamance. And the things that he was preaching began to cause quite a bit of consternation. Now, the German Reformed people who had already signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9 and were already very involved in the Regulator movement loved what he was preaching. But the Lutherans were very concerned that that his preaching was contrary to Romans 13, to that passage about being subject to the higher powers. And so the Lutherans felt that they should not be getting involved in this sort of thing, and started to find him, as the German Reformed church historian Reverend Welker wrote 150 years later, that Reverend Souther began to become obnoxious to the supporters of the crown, and so the Lutherans demanded that he not be allowed in their pulpits. Now, the Lau's Church on Samuel Lau's land over here was fundamentally a Lutheran church, because Samuel Lau, who gave the land and helped build the church, was himself Lutheran. And so the Lau Church members booted him out and refused to let Reverend Souther preach from their pulpit any longer. And so the German Reformed people of the congregation left, and they formed this church up here, what was originally called the Clap Church, or Die Klappkirche, but has come to be known today as the Brick Church in extreme eastern Guilford County. Brick German Reformed Church, or now Brick United Church of Christ. And so they moved off and formed their own church here. By contrast, Stoner's Church at the other end of this community was on the land of Conrad Stoner, and had been built in part through his efforts. Conrad Stoner was a German Reformed Calvinist, and so instead of the Calvinists being kicked out of this church, the Lutherans were kicked out of this church, and they moved off and formed what is now Graves, or what became known quickly as Graves Lutheran Church, and is now known today as St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alamance County. Anyway, I thought this map was particularly interesting because it shows us the denominational aspects of the conflict, as Troy Kickler was alluding to earlier. And then what else I think is particularly interesting here about both this map and the previous map is that although we see the names of quite a few landowners who were not actively participating in the Regulator movement in 1768, it appears that by 1771, pretty much all of these people were in fact at the Battle of Alamance, at the Alamance battleground here in May of 1771. That is to say, sometime between April 1768 and May 1771, many of these people had changed their minds and had joined in with the Regulators, because there were events that that happened in that time period in between which outraged them. And the same thing is true, we find, with the Presbyterians. I showed you that map that shows that none of those Presbyterians in Guilford County had signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9, but the biographer of Reverend David Caldwell clearly states that many of the people in Reverend Caldwell's congregation were in fact at the Battle of Alamance, and various church histories of both Buffalo Presbyterian and Alamance Presbyterian make the same point, that many of those people who had refused to sign Regulator Advertisement number 9 in April of 1768 were 3 years later among those who were at the Battle of Alamance in May 1771. And in fact, at least one member of Buffalo Presbyterian Church was killed at the Battle of Alamance. All right, now I'm going to switch to our third map. And again, I apologize for not being a little more sophisticated about how to make this happen, but here's the third map. And this map is a map of, again, you can see in the upper right, the area map shows you the approximate area that this map covers. It covers extreme northeast Randolph County. This is the Sandy Creek neighborhood, and here at the center of this neighborhood, right here, is where Sandy Creek Baptist Church was. The Sandy Creek Baptist Church is that church which Troy Kickler mentioned earlier, one of the first Baptist churches of the North Carolina Piedmont, or perhaps the first Baptist church of the North Carolina Piedmont, and a church which, through many twists and turns, founded an organization that eventually became what is now the Southern Baptist Convention. So this church, Sandy Creek Baptist Church, which Troy showed us a slide of earlier, is really the intellectual and theological center of the Southern Baptist Convention. But that's not why I showed you this slide. The reason I showed you this slide is to show you that the people who are shown in orange here are landowners who signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9. So we can see that quite a few people in the Sandy Creek area signed Regulator Advertisement number 9. And in the sort of more gold or mustard color are highlighted landowners who appear to be relatives of people who signed Regulator Advertisement number 9. Some of the people who signed these regulator petitions were sort of concerned that there might be consequences to them, and that there might be consequences to their ability to own land in Orange County in the future. And so it appears that in some cases, somebody like, say, William Wellborn right here, or Wilborn right here, did not sign Regulator Advertisement number 9, but he had, because he was a landowner and was concerned about the title to his land, but instead had one of his sons, Thomas Wilborn, I believe it was, sign on to Regulator Advertisement number 9 in his place, so as to register the protest without necessarily jeopardizing his land ownership. So between these gold or mustard highlighted people and the people who are highlighted in orange here, we can see that Sandy Creek, the Sandy Creek Valley, was absolutely lit up with people who had signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9. Now, in fairness, I should point out that a large amount of this land was owned by Harmon Husband, whom Troy mentioned earlier as the pamphleteer, the sort of voice, public spokesman of the regulator movement. So it's maybe slightly misleading, because Harmon Husband owned probably about, at this particular time, probably about 1,500 or 2,000 acres. So there's a large part of this orange that's really just one man, Harmon Husband. But you can see that there are also quite a few others, like William Ward and Stephen Jones and Thomas Swift and so forth, who also signed on to that petition. There's a tremendous amount of involvement in the Sandy Creek neighborhood. And even though Harmon Husband had been a Quaker, it is notable that Husband was actually ejected from the Quaker church. He was kicked out for reasons that if you're interested, you can Google my or YouTube my name, and you'll find a video where I have a whole hour-long presentation on how it was that Harmon Husband came to be kicked out of the Quaker Church. But he was kicked out of the Quaker Church by this time, 1768. And he had owned a large amount of land in this area, even more than the 1,500 acres that are shown with his name on them now. He'd owned a much larger area, which he had bought basically on real estate speculation, seeking to sell that land to his fellow Quakers whom he hoped would move to the area from Philadelphia. Well, lots of Quakers did move to Orange County, but they did not move to the Sandy Creek area, perhaps in part because Harmon Husband was such a controversial figure. And instead, Harmon Husband sold a good bit of this land to a group of Baptists who came from Virginia and moved to this area, including, as Troy mentioned earlier, Shubal Stearns, the founder of Sandy Creek Baptist Church. A number of these other people shown on this map were also involved in the founding of Sandy Creek Baptist Church. For example, I know for a fact Enos Stinson, who's shown right here, was involved in the founding of the church, and also Seymour York. However, and I think part of the reason I'm showing you this map, and one of the things that I think is notable about it, is that basically Sandy Creek Baptist Church is completely surrounded by people who signed on to Regulator Advertisement number 9, who were involved in the Regulator uprising in April of 1768. Now, there was a historian of the Baptist Church in North Carolina, a guy by the name of Morgan Edwards, who came through this area from Virginia and did a lot of research in coming up with his history of the Baptist Church. And he traveled through this area in the mid to late 1770s, like 1775, 1776 kind of time frame, and then later wrote up his notes. And he claims in his history of the Baptist Church in North Carolina that there were only a handful of Baptists who were involved in the Regulator movement. But I think this map really demonstrates that what he says is not particularly plausible, that in fact, it seems as though this very Baptist neighborhood around Sandy Creek Baptist Church had many people who were involved from an early date in April of 1768 in the Regulator movement. I can't prove that absolutely because unfortunately the records of Sandy Creek Baptist Church were burned in a house fire in 1816 or so. So we don't have the original records to be able to go back and look up the names of the people who were involved. Like, in other words, we can't prove John Owen, who's right here, was a member of Sandy Creek Baptist Church. And likewise, the technique that I used in the Germanic neighborhoods and in the Presbyterian neighborhoods is not effective here. The technique of looking at the names on old gravestones in the churchyard at Sandy Creek Baptist Church, because whether it be for economic or religious reasons, unfortunately, very few of the old graves at Sandy Creek Baptist Church are marked, or if they are marked, they're marked with plain field stones that don't bear the names of the people buried below. So it's difficult to say who all were the founders of Sandy Creek Baptist Church, but I think it's safe to assume that many of the people who lived in the immediate vicinity were among those who were members of this church. That's part of why they lived here, and it's just a natural function of living so close to this particular church. And if that assumption is correct, then I think we can see that there were indeed many Baptists who were involved in the Regulator movement in the early days in April 1768. So that's most of what I wanted to present. And I'll just touch on one other thing, which is that, it isn't 100% clear what it was that happened between May 1768 and May 1771 that caused so many Presbyterians to change their mind about which side of the Regulator conflict they wanted to be on, or change, for that matter, the minds of so many Lutherans on the same account. But I suspect that basically part of the reason is that in 1769, Harmon Husband pursued a series of lawsuits, and criminal charges were brought against some of the local officials who were corrupt in North Carolina, including Orange County Register of Deeds Edmund Fanning. But nothing ever came of the civil suits that Harmon Husband attempted to bring. The court system basically dismissed him out of hand. And the criminal complaints that were brought against the likes of Edmund Fanning, Fanning was found guilty on some of the charges that were brought against him, but he was fined the absolute minimum fine, basically 1 penny for his transgressions. And it later was eventually actually cleared basically on appeal of those charges. And I think many of the people of Orange County really, and Rowan County, really began, even those people who had been reluctant to be a part of the Regulator movement in April 1768, by a year later, were feeling very cynical about the opportunities for any kind of other reform to happen, because they could see that the court system had no intention of taking these complaints seriously. And then later that year in 1769, Harmon Husband and a slate of other regulator candidates were elected from both Orange and Rowan counties to the assembly, to the what's now the state legislature, but to, then called the assembly. And the governor basically forbid the assembly to meet in 1769, and they had to wait until 1770 for a session of the assembly to meet. And when it did, one of the first things that the assembly did was all gang up on Harmon Husband and vote to censure him and kick him out of the assembly. So between the disappointments of the results of the court suits in 1769 and the further disappointment of the legislature, or excuse me, the assembly, refusing to allow Harmon Husband to bring forward the political issues that were of concern to the North Carolina Piedmont, I think people had become utterly hopeless about the notion that any kind of lawful method of reform would bring about a resolution to the problems that Orange County and Rowan County farmers were facing. And consequently, even the Lutherans and Presbyterians who'd been reluctant to get involved in the regulator movement at first changed their minds and joined the regulators at the Battle of Alamance. And that's what I've got. So,
yeah. So we have one question to start out, and that is these fascinating maps. How can viewers access them? Are they on your website, Orange County's website, or?
They're not yet on our website. I will endeavor to put them there. There's always, one of the problems with creating historical maps like this is that every time you go to publish one of them, it's guaranteed that within the next month or so, you'll discover a number of additional things you wish you had put on there. So I've been kind of holding off for a while on publishing some of these maps, but this talk maybe will give us a good impetus to go ahead and get at least drafts of these maps published on the Orange County Register of Deeds website. And of course, you can also look at some of these, at least at a course level, you can look at them in the replay of this video, which I think will be available. How will this video be available, actually?
So we did record, and I'm sorry that I kind of started the recording a little bit after Troy started speaking. That was my fault. But we will send out that Zoom link that'll be good on a very temporary basis, maybe a week or so. Meanwhile, our staff is going to work to post it on YouTube and get the transcription in good order on YouTube. But that may take some time. So we'll have a short-term link available in the next couple of days. I'll send out an email to all registrants.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? We're almost right at 1 o'clock, so we're doing perfectly. Let's see.
So one question is, where are you going next with your research?
I have a couple of other maps I've been working on. The one that I'm working on right at the not right at the moment, but on more recently than these maps is a map of the Quaker settlement in modern Orange County in the vicinity of Hillsborough, the county seat of Orange County. There were a large number of Quakers who lived there, who moved there in the 1750s and lived there into the 1760s. But many of them moved away to Georgia in 1766 through 1768. And I've done some research. And again, if you want to search for me on YouTube, you'll find it's connected with that video that I alluded to earlier about Harmon Husband, and why he was kicked out of the Quaker Church. But many of the events that led to Harmon Husband being kicked out of King Creek Friends meeting were also related to the reasons that so many of the Quakers left from the Hillsborough area. But anyway, so I'm working on a map of that area, which hopes to show what all land in the Hillsborough area was owned by members of the Quaker Church.
Okay, and we just had a question to follow up what your argument is about Baptists being well involved, in contrast to Morgan Edwards. And someone's asking if you believe that's the case because so many Baptist families left the area after the battle. Does that have anything to do with your conclusions?
There's a historian named Sheets who wrote History of the Liberty Baptist Association. I can't remember his first name, but and he makes essentially that argument that he asserts that some 1,500 Baptist families moved from the North Carolina Piedmont westward into the mountains of North Carolina, into Tennessee, in the time that followed the Regulator or the Battle of Alamance. And he also supposes that their departure from this area is part of the reason that Sandy Creek Baptist Church all but collapsed. I'm not entirely convinced that everything that Mr. Sheets asserts is correct. I'm not prepared to dispute what he says, but I have some questions in my mind about some of the things that Sheets asserts. For example, how is it that we know, or what is the evidence that 1,500 families left this area? He doesn't really, as I recall anyway, he doesn't really give us a source for that claim. And I'll also say 1,500 families, maybe 1,500 individuals I might be able to believe, but 1,500 families is a massive number. And in fact, it's hard for me to believe that there even were 1,500 Baptist families in this area at that time. So I think that is, I'm not going to say that what he says is false or incorrect, but I find some aspects of what he's arguing difficult to believe. However, if he is in fact factually correct that 1,500 families or even 1,500 Baptist individuals left this area after the Battle of Alamance, then I certainly think it's good evidence that what he's saying is the case. But what I think is better evidence that what he's saying is that Baptists were very involved in the Regulator movement is that when Governor Tryon marched with his militia after the Battle of Alamance across the North Carolina Piedmont in a sort of show of force and victory lap around the North Carolina Piedmont, he marched right through this area and around Sandy Creek Baptist Church, and he burned much of the area. He burned, now in fairness, we'll acknowledge that he burned Harmon Husband's farm, and Harmon Husband was not a Baptist, but he burned Husband's farm because Husband was such a prominent figure in the Regulator movement. But other farms in that area were burned as well, and I think that's some kind of indication that he was exacting retribution against Baptists in that area. And it's also notable that the other area that he burned was 30 or so miles away when they arrived in the Jersey settlement in Davidson County, and they burned many of the farms in that area as well. And that is the location of one of the other early Baptist churches of the North Carolina Piedmont, Jersey Baptist Church. And it's also clear that many of the people who were members of Jersey Baptist Church were involved in the Regulator movement there. We didn't get into that, and I've never tried to map that area because it's just too far outside of my area of expertise. But it's clear that Benjamin Merrill, who was a captain in the Rowan militia and who changed sides and led members of Jersey Baptist Church to confront Hugh Waddell and forces that were seeking to come from Rowan and Mecklenburg and Tryon counties to head up to the Battle of Alamance. They met the militia forces from those western counties on the road and blocked their advance and prevented them from joining in with Governor Tryon at the Battle of Alamance. And Benjamin Merrill was among the people who was later executed in Hillsborough because of his efforts there. He was clearly a member, he was clearly a Baptist and was clearly a member of Jersey Baptist Church. And many of the men that helped him do that were also members of Jersey Baptist Church. And that is the reason that that area was the other area that was burned. So I think we see two neighborhoods that were burned, both of them homes to Baptist churches. That sort of tells the whole story to me.
So maybe I'll end with kind of a dumb question, and it's my question, but why do you say husband's first name is Harmon when we hear it as Herman in a lot of other places?
So in looking through the old land records of Orange County, I find it spelled Harmon as often as, or more often than it is spelled Hermon. Now we do know that that husband himself published pamphlets in which he spelled out his own name in typeface, so that it's not debatable about what the handwriting says. And he clearly spelled it each time Hermon. But my belief is that that although he spelled it Herman, that he apparently said it more like Harmon, because the majority of places where other people are referring to him or other people have written his name out, it is spelled that other way, Harmon. And I guess what I picture is that he probably actually pronounced it somewhere in between, like Harmon, something like that. It's also
a German
notable,
pronunciation, maybe?
yeah, maybe. It's also notable that he had a first cousin whose name was Harmon Cox. And Harmon Cox's name is consistently spelled Harmon, not Her. And I assume that both of them are drawing that same name from the same source, which I think is further evidence that he probably said it Harmon. It's also notable that his name is frequently, sometimes it's husband, sometimes it's husbands, plural. And it seems that at least when he wrote it, he usually wrote it husbands with an S, plural, although he remains today most commonly known by the name Herman, husband, singular. But anyway, Herman, Harmon, husband, husbands, whatever.
Yeah, definitely spelling was flexible in that era. So yeah, we had people engaged in the chat, and one of our colleagues from Historic Preservation believes that your maps would be great to overlay with some of the GIS work her office has done. So maybe we can get you all connected a little better after the presentation.
That sounds great. I would love that.
Great. Anything else, Becky?
Well, I just want to point out that we have digitized the War of the Regulation military collection papers, and they are now in the North Carolina Digital Collection. So if anybody wants to take time and look at those, it's an artificial collection of original materials, but there is some jewels mixed in that collection, even though it's a really small collection. So I suggest those people who are interested in in the Regulator movement, spent some time with those records as well.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for having me. And thank you, Troy, for that excellent outline at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you both for educating the rest of us. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did too. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.